The moment that secret file landed inside palace walls, everything changed for Harry because this was no longer about bruised feelings, family tension, or another wave of cold royal silence. This was about a private confrontation so serious, so controlled, and so devastatingly direct that by the end of it, Harry was no longer dealing with whispers from the margins. He was staring at what insiders are calling the final royal warning. It started the way the biggest royal implosions always start. Not with a public announcement, not with some dramatic palace statement read from a gold-trimmed podium, but with movement behind closed doors. Sudden movement, coordinated movement, the kind of movement that tells you somebody high up has decided the situation has gone too far and now the soft gloves are off. 1 minute, the usual silence. The next, senior aides were said to be circulating a sealed file so sensitive that only a handful of people were allowed near it, and once Harry got word that this document was no rumor, not a bluff, not another tabloid fantasy, the mood reportedly shifted from irritation to panic. Because this file was said to contain the one thing Harry never wanted formalized, an internal record of private breaches, private conversations, and private lines crossed that the palace had apparently chosen not to expose until now. And that is where the story gets vicious, because according to the whispers now tearing through royal circles, this was not just some dusty archive folder dragged out for show. No, this was described as a live document, a running internal record, a quiet accumulation of moments, concerns, warnings, and alleged betrayals that had been stacked one on top of another, while Harry kept believing the palace would stay trapped in its usual strategy of saying nothing and enduring everything. But there comes a point, apparently, when silence stops being patience and starts becoming weakness, and somebody inside that machine decided they were done looking weak. The confrontation itself was said to be private, brutal in tone, and stripped of all family warmth. No soothing language, no emotional cushioning, no tender phrases about healing and reconciliation. Just a message, cold and direct. There would be limits, there would be consequences, and there would not be another chance to test how far the monarchy could be pushed. That is what makes this so explosive. Because Harry has spent years operating in that gray zone where royal blood still gives him global relevance, yet distance from the institution gives him freedom to criticize it. But this warning, if insiders are to be believed, was about shutting that gray zone down once and for all. What was in the file? That is the question swallowing the whole drama. Some claim it included summaries of private calls, others insist it tracked commercial moves, media strategies, and attempts to use royal proximity while publicly condemning the very system that made that proximity powerful in the first place. And then there is the most poisonous whisper of all, that palace officials were especially enraged by the idea that sensitive family tensions had been repeatedly turned into leverage, turned into product, turned into narrative fuel, until senior royals no longer saw this as emotional fallout from a broken family, but as a pattern, a method, a strategy. That word keeps coming up behind the scenes. Strategy, not pain, not misunderstanding. Strategy. And if that word truly entered the room, then Harry was in worse trouble than he realized, because once the palace stops viewing your behavior as hurt and starts viewing it as calculated, the mercy evaporates. Suddenly, every interview is not catharsis but attack. Every reveal is not honesty but pressure. Every emotional confession becomes, in palace eyes, a tactical release. That is why this confrontation reportedly felt so different. Harry was not being scolded as a son or a brother. He was being assessed as a problem. And what makes the whole thing even more chilling is the claim that this warning did not come from one irritated figure acting alone. No, the mood, insiders suggest, had hardened across the core of the institution. Charles, increasingly tired of the cycle. William, long past the point of trust. Anne, grim and unsentimental as ever. Even those who once argued for restraint were said to be losing patience, because every effort to lower the temperature seemed to be followed by another leak, another insinuation, another splash of public grievance. The file then was not just a record, it was a signal that the family had quietly become an institution again, and institutions do not cry, they calculate. Harry reportedly expected tension. He reportedly expected distance. But what he was not prepared for, according to the gossip now spilling outward, was the finality in the room. The sense that the line had already been drawn before he walked in. The sense that this meeting was not about negotiation, but notification. That the decision to confront him had already been made, and the only question left was whether he understood understood what came next if he ignored it. Because the real terror here is not that the palace has a file. The real terror is that the palace may have decided it is finally willing to use it. Because once a monarchy that has spent centuries perfecting silence decides it is willing to act, it does not act halfway, it does not test reactions, it does not leak intentions to gauge public sympathy, it simply moves. And what Harry reportedly felt in that room was not anger, not shouting, not even visible frustration, but something far more unsettling. The calm certainty of people who already know the outcome and are no longer interested in debating it. That is what turned this confrontation from tense to terrifying, because there is a difference between being argued with and being informed, and by every whispered account now circulating, Harry was not argued with, he was informed. The message, as insiders describe it, was layered but unmistakable, and every layer carried the same core idea: there will be no more tolerance for blurred lines, no more acceptance of private access combined with public exposure, no more room for operating both inside and outside the institution, depending on what benefits the moment. That dual position, the one that gave Harry power in interviews and influence in business, is now being framed as the very thing that triggered the palace to escalate, because from their perspective, it allowed him to keep one foot in privilege while using the other to destabilize it. And once that interpretation locked into place, the file stopped being a precaution and became a weapon waiting for authorization. What makes this even more dramatic is the claim that specific consequences were quietly outlined, not announced, not written down for the public to dissect, but communicated in that controlled, clinical way the palace uses when it wants something understood without leaving fingerprints. Access could be limited further. Invitations could disappear entirely. Private channels of communication could be shut down. And perhaps most significantly, the protection of silence, the one shield that had allowed so many controversies to remain unconfirmed, could be lifted. That last point is the one that has people watching this story with a kind of nervous fascination. Because if the palace ever decides to speak not in hints but in facts, the narrative shifts overnight, and Harry, who has spent years controlling the public version of events, suddenly loses that control. And then there is the emotional layer that makes this feel less like strategy and more like collapse. Because for all the institutional language, for all the calculated messaging, this is still a family fracture happening in real time. And according to those close to the situation, there was a moment in that confrontation where the personal broke through the procedural, not in dramatic speeches or raised voices, but in the absence of warmth and the complete removal of any trace of the relationship that once existed. No reassurance, no softening, no suggestion that this was temporary, just distance. Final, deliberate distance. That is the part that reportedly hit hardest, because it signaled something deeper than a warning. It signaled a shift in how Harry is now seen within the royal structure, not as a difficult member who might return, not as a rebellious figure who might reconcile, but as someone who has stepped outside the system and is now being treated accordingly. And once that classification changes, everything changes, because the monarchy is built on roles, and when your role is removed, the institution does not adjust itself to accommodate you, it adjusts its boundaries to exclude you. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the ripple effects of this confrontation have already begun to surface in subtle ways. The kind of ways that only the most obsessive royal watchers pick up on at first: fewer references, tighter messaging, a noticeable absence of any attempt to publicly defend or soften Harry's position. It is not loud, it is not aggressive, but it is consistent, and consistency is how the palace signals permanence. One move means nothing. A pattern means everything. And Harry, for the first time in this entire saga, is said to be facing a reality he cannot spin, cannot reframe, cannot turn into a narrative advantage, because this is not a public dispute anymore. It is a closed system response, and closed systems do not negotiate in public view. They enforce quietly, they adjust internally, and they wait, knowing that time, structure, and control are on their side. The most chilling part of all of this is not what has happened, but what has been set in motion, because a final warning is never just about the present moment, it is about the next move, the one that determines whether the situation stabilizes or detonates. And if Harry chooses to ignore what was delivered in that room, if he pushes again, if he tests those boundaries one more time, then the file that triggered this confrontation may not stay private, and the silence that has protected both sides for years may finally break. And if that happens, the story everyone thought they understood will be replaced by something far more controlled, far more structured, and far less forgiving. Because when the monarchy decides it is done absorbing damage, it does not retaliate emotionally. emotionally, it responds systematically. And A, systematic response from an institution like this does not create noise, it creates outcomes. That is why this moment matters more than any interview, any documentary, any public statement that came before it, because this is the point where the balance shifted, where the palace stopped reacting and started defining the terms, and where Harry, for the first time, is no longer setting the pace of the story, but trying to keep up with it.